Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everyone who's here for the panel. I'm really grateful to everyone for attending and for the panelists for coming here to talk about the importance of supply chains in democratizing work and really the challenges they pose for those of us who are trying to think about what that means in a truly global economy. My name's Ben Kean. I'm the author of the book Disorienting Neoliberalism, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the arguments I make in the book about the importance of global supply chains for understanding the global economy and for understanding and the importance that I think solidarity between workers and consumers and supply chains has at this moment. Unfortunately, Tola Moeun from central Cambodia will not be able to join us. He's got a family illness to attend to. But we are joined by Jessica Champagne from the Worker Rights Consortium and Bienias from the Clean Clothes Campaign. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by making a presentation before turning it over to them to talk a little bit more about some of the details of their work with supply chains and some of the particular challenges that the global pandemic has posed for this work. So I am going to share a, so yell at me, fellow panelists, if that doesn't work. So that you can tell me. All right, can folks see the slideshow?
Oh yeah, yeah, there it is.
Okay, yeah, it seems like there's a little bit of a lag, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. We're also joined by a new rescue dog who's making the rounds of the room. So, so I want to start just by talking about an incident that a lot of people are probably aware of, which is the collapse of the factories at Rana Plaza. So in 2013, more than 1,000 workers died in Dhaka, Bangladesh, making clothes to export to the US and Europe for multinational brands. And I think that cases like this pose a particular challenge for those of us who are interested in democratizing work. What does it mean to democratize work in this kind of a case where the workers in these factories weren't directly employed by the company, by the retailers that ultimately sold these clothes, a fact that many of the retailers used as a reason to disavow responsibility for this. But this is obviously a very common form of production in the global economy today. And so I think it raises some particularly acute challenges. What does it mean to have sort of fairness and justice in supply chains? What kind of a say? I mean, if we think that workers in general deserve a say and they deserve fair treatment, does the fact that these workers aren't directly employed by the companies involved matter at all? And what will it take, of course, to actually give supply chain workers a voice in the supply chain? So I want to put this particular catastrophe in the context of the global economy, and in particular the context of the neoliberalism of the past 50 years, which has transformed the global economy in a particular kind of way. Because Jessica and Anne are going to focus on, I think, more of the work that they've done with workers in supply chains, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about what all this means for consumers in supply chains and how they've been shaped and affected by neoliberalism. So I should also say I'm trained as a political theorist. I'm not a kind of empirical social scientist, so I'm working with a lot of philosophical resources. But I do think that these kinds of political theories can be helpful in helping us make sense of the world. And broadly, what I think that we can do is we can provide a sense of how things, social and political arrangements operate, but also how they're legitimated. What are the stories we tell about things like supply chains that make them seem normal and fair when, you know, for many of us, we're aware that there are in fact great injustices that are a part of these structures. And then what are some values that we can promote, like democracy, that can reorient us to these kinds of structures? And so I take it as a political theorist, I'm at least, you know, qualified to talk about things like democracy. So I want to talk about how neoliberalism has structured our world and our way of seeing the world, and then talk why global supply chains are a really helpful way of kind of delegitimizing those stories and showing why neoliberalism, why the global economy as it currently operates isn't in the interest of either workers or consumers. And in the larger project, as a theorist, I spend some more time talking about how we should think about freedom in the context of these supply chains, but I'm not going to emphasize that today. So I want to do this first part talking about how neoliberalism has structured our world. I think a lot of people, at least in the US context, are probably familiar with this graph, which shows how starting in the early 70s, we see this giant gap opening up between workers' productivity and their hourly compensation. Right? You can see we're entering a really different economic phase in the post-World War II era in the US. Productivity and compensation grew basically in the same way. Starting in the 70s, we see this giant disconnect, right? Productivity has gone up 240% over the past 50 years. Hourly compensation, has not really budged in comparison. So part of what that means is, where are those gains going? Who's capturing all of this, right? It's things like supply chains increase efficiency, but it's clear that workers and consumers aren't the only people, aren't necessarily the main beneficiaries of those efficiencies. Within the US context, right, this has contributed to massive inequality. As you can see, the first graph is the share of American wealth owned by the 400 richest Americans, which has gone up since 1980. Meanwhile, the share of American wealth owned by the bottom 60% has gone down. You can see it's never really recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. And of course, that's part of a global story, one that, as we'll talk about, has been intensified by the global pandemic. So this is a chart, right? Inequality globally has increased dramatically over the past year and a half. As laborers have lost income, as factories have had to close. Meanwhile, stock market continues to do well. Billionaires have gained almost $4 trillion in wealth. So we're in this context of widening inequality. And yet, at least until, for many people, that's just the way the world is, right? Why is it that we live in this world where inequality has been increasing so significantly for 50 years? So I think a lot of people use this term neoliberalism to describe what's going on. I want to say a little bit about what that means, because it can be kind of a complicated and abused term, right? I use it to refer to two things, right? Both a set of policies that have been pursued to among other things, dramatically grow inequality, right? The privatization of government functions, a switch from a focus on kind of Keynesian deficit spending to austerity or reducing deficits, the growing financialization of the economy, and the rise of global supply chains, which really are a phenomenon of the past 30, 35 years, and are a pretty recent development in their current form. But neoliberalism isn't just these actual practices, it also offers a theory that legitimates them, right? It offers a way of saying why those kinds of things make sense. And so it is basically a worldview developed by people like the guys you see here, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and others, whose books have been hugely popular in shaping popular imagination about markets, right? It's a view that says politics is really at the service of the market. It's not a libertarian view, it's not a laissez-faire view, as I think it's often understood. It is a view that, in fact, offers a very forceful role for the government in creating the circumstances in which there can be competition, right? So lots of forms of government force and coercion look natural or legitimate if they're used to create efficient markets on this view. So I think that's important because when we look at the neoliberal global economy and we think about what is the role of the state and government in all of these things, it's not that the government is hands-off, right? On the contrary, if we look, for example, back at Bangladesh, there's been intensive state action to build infrastructure and to coercively kind of depoliticize areas to create the conditions for free trade, right? These export processing zones that are created by the state effectively are a relocation of borders, right? There's often customs at the borders of these sites. There's different laws prohibiting freedom of association within them. And in this case, the Bangladesh Export Processing Zone Authority is actually, the head of it is also, I think, a colonel in the Bangladesh Armed Forces. So there's a very obvious and direct connection between state coercion and this form of freedom, right? This kind of free trade. And this is, at this point, according to the UN, about 80% of global trade now is now conducted through these transnational supply chains. But there's a different way that neoliberalism shapes us, right? It's not just this kind of intensive state coercion, but it's also the idea that we're all supposed to be entrepreneurs. And that's true of people in the US, that's also true of people in many of these other countries who need to get ahead without any kind of social safety net. So we're in a situation now where many people have to, in the US, for example, people have to look at themselves through these kinds of economic orientations, right? They need to think about things like education, not as a liberal arts education pursued for its own sake, but as an investment. And it's not just a kind of ideological force that makes them do that. It's the fact that, in fact, student debt is now the second largest source of debt in the US after housing. So people owe now, this is actually a slightly outdated chart, it's now more like $1.6 trillion in student loans in the US. So of course, if you're going into debt for education, you have to think about it as an investment, right? You need to think about these things on economic terms. So how do we break with this kind of pervasive neoliberal world that we've been living in for 50 years? And so I do think that thinking about solidarity and supply chains, as we'll talk about for the rest of the session, is a key part of that. Right, supply chains are a relatively new development, right? I think we can contrast them with a different model of production that you see in the early 20th century, right? Embodied in kind of the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant, which made literally every single part of Model A cars, including the glass and steel, right? Ford owns and controls every step of the process, compared to now when many of these functions have been disaggregated into different companies, where, this is, I think, a traditional, I mean, not a traditional, but this is a pretty common feature of the global economy today, right? This is about how Nike shoes get made, right? So you have Nike designers in Oregon sending ideas to a design firm in Taiwan, who sends, specifications to an engineering firm in South Korea, which then sends the actual engineering data to a factory in Indonesia for assembly. Right, and then when you're assembling the shoes, you're getting foam from Saudi Arabian petroleum, you're getting rubber soles that have been refined in South Korea, you're getting, leather from cows slaughtered in Texas, you're getting tissue paper from Indonesian trees that then get sent to the US to a paper mill in New Mexico. Those boxes then get sent back to Indonesia. So you've got this really, I think, often referred to as something like dizzying or, disorienting feature where the very shoes on our feet have been to more parts of the world than we'll ever be. And this way of building things is really different. And it's one that, of course, is now under threat as part of the global pandemic, as these supply chains have seen all of these different kinds of interruptions, right? All of these things only work if every part in the chain gets its piece delivered on time. And of course, there have been huge challenges in that during the pandemic, which has revealed how really brittle these supply chains can be. And I think that opens up possibilities for rethinking these models, right? So part of the question is, what does it mean to have democracy in the workplace for all these different people contributing to these supply chains, right? Nike is going to throw up its hands in the air and say, well, it's not really dealing with most of these firms at all, right? It has nothing to do, for example, with the cows slaughtered in Texas that go to make the leather, so why should they have to do anything? And of course, there is beyond that, right? Even once you have the shoe assembled in the Indonesian factory, there's the entire logistics side of this, right? Where there's new opportunities for worker exploitation and new questions about what it will take to give workers voice within the supply chain context, right? You've got the workers on the ships, the container ships moving things back to the US ports. You've got the truck drivers who are moving things from the distribution centers to the stores. There's all different kinds of workers here that have a stake in these chains. So I'd say the prevailing way of looking at these chains within neoliberalism is to say, this is just a kind of spontaneous order. This is just what the economy looks like, right? It's just magic that all these things are happening. All these people are making independent financial decisions. And so we don't need to take responsibility for anyone else's choices, right? All this is different people making different choices. But in that sense, right, we're supposed to think that supply chains are just kind of corporations that have kind of disaggregated, and because that's just more efficient, and that's just what markets are like, right? But of course, that's not really how supply chains work. In fact, these lead brands provide very specific directions to many of the firms further down the chain, and there's no reason why workers who are employed at these firms further down the chain shouldn't be given a voice within all of these other firms, especially given the fact that the lead brands are making decisions that are determining the wages and working conditions of people further down. So why should consumers care? Why should we think that consumers are going to benefit from being in solidarity with these workers? Right? And I think it's worth just spending a couple of minutes before I wrap up thinking about how these chains don't just exert power over workers, but how these chains also exert power over consumers, right? These brands don't merely sort of try and guess at what the trends are going to be. They try and actively train us, both to give up our information to them and also to buy the things they want us to buy, right? So these brands often have a staggering amount of information about us, right? 75% of all US adults have smartphones, which are basically, as I think we all kind of know, intense surveillance devices, right? These phones enable these companies to get vast amounts of tracking data with a startling degree of specificity, right? They're not just having our GPS located, but within many of the retailers, Bluetooth beacons are set up, so they know how much time we're spending in what aisles. They're aggregating all this information. And they're also buying further information to correlate it with others who are tracking our activity on the internet, right? From buying from these data brokers most of us have never heard of. So part of what makes the supply chains, I think, such an effective form of corporate power is that for consumers, we only experience ourselves as being a part of the chain at the moment that we buy something. And we think for the most part, maybe it's the workers in these factories who are there, and even they're not in part of the chain all of the time because their factories aren't producing for the same companies all the time, right? But in fact, I think consumers should think of themselves as being a part of these chains all of the time because these brands are tracking us, they are trying to train our behavior, and they are trying to get us to buy the things that they want to sell us in a pretty direct way. Right? There's other ways in which we can see supply chains as a way of trying to understand the politics that are in the economy that I just want to touch on briefly, right? If neoliberalism says the market is this kind of spontaneous order where people are just making decisions, anyone who knows how supply chains really work knows that that's just not how these chains, most of these chains work, right? They rely on cooperation and standardization throughout their functioning. And so someone who's like a supply chain manager, in order to be effective, needs to know a lot about what's going on in these other companies. They're not just, buying something randomly, but in cases of companies like Walmart or Nike or Apple, making really intense and specific demands on the other companies in the chain. Given that, there's no reason why we shouldn't ask them to also be making, to listening not just to the managers of those places, but to the workers as well. So I want to suggest that building solidarity between workers and consumers in supply chains can be a really powerful way of resisting the neoliberal global economy and sort of reorienting ourselves to a very different world, to understand these supply chains not as kind of apolitical economic exchanges, but as being created through very intense exercises of state power, and being sustained by a lot of claims to authority, being sustained by power that's exerted not just over workers, but over consumers too, which is one of the things that gives us a reason to act in solidarity and to listen to calls for solidarity from workers, like the calls issued by the workers in Bangladesh in the wake of the Rana Plaza collapse. So hopefully that is gives some context for thinking about the importance of supply chains and solidarity between workers and consumers in supply chains. Now I want to turn it over to Jessica Champagne from the Workers' Rights Consortium to talk a little bit about her work at the WRC on building and exercising that kind of solidarity. Jessica's the Deputy Director for Strategy and Field Operations at the Workers' Rights Consortium, which is an independent labor rights monitoring organization. And she coordinates investigations in apparel factories around the world and engages with the international apparel brands and retailers to correct those violations. Her team's advocacy has already resulted in tens of millions of dollars in back pay for garment workers, as well as the reinstatement of numerous workers and the correction of many significant health and safety violations. Thanks for coming, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm wondering if before I get started, we should try to do a sound check for Anna. I know that she had sound and then she lost it. Should we just see if you can?
I might be back. Am I back?
You're back.
Yes.
All right.
Okay, great.
Great. Then I'll go ahead and talk, and then we'll know that when it's your turn, you'll be connected. That's great. Awesome. So thank you, Ben. That's a really helpful reminder of how the supply chain has been kind of deliberately constructed for, for reasons of the companies that created it, and didn't just sort of organically arise free of any political choice, and kind of how we're all tied up in it. As Ben said, I'm with the Worker Rights Consortium. We're an organization that conducts independent investigations and advocacy to press for worker rights and supply chains, particularly the apparel industry. And I'm also going to try to share a PowerPoint and give sort of an overview of how this industry is structured and how that drives some of the worker rights violations that we see. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. So, the garment industry employs 35 million people, of whom more than 80% are women. And as I'm sure you know, these workers' lives are marked by the same abuses that low-wage, precarious workers around the world experience. Wage theft, gender-based violence and harassment, extremely unsafe workplaces. And this is compounded by the fact that when workers speak out about these violations of their basic rights, employers consistently threaten them, fire them, and even assault them. These violations are really driven by the structure of the industry. So the hallmark of the garment industry, of course, has been noted as this contracting out, really creating distance between the workers and the brands and retailers at the top of the supply chain. These brands and retailers may be separated from the workers through a number of steps. They are sourcing out to factories. They may do that through brokers or agents. The factories may source it out, may job that work out further to a subcontractor. They may use a labor broker, particularly to hire migrant workers. They may send work home with workers to do embroidery or other work at home. And so there's really this increasing distance between the brands and retailers and the workers. This really leads to 5 key dynamics. As Ben and I talked about, there's this outsourced production. The company, the name that you're seeing on the clothing is not the company that's actually making the clothing. Those brands and retailers make only short-term contracts with the factories that they use. So the factories are just receiving orders for specific products for a short period of time. There's no kind of long-term commitment. The brands also spread out their orders to avoid concentrating too much production in any one factory. So that means that each factory has a lot of different customers that they have to satisfy, and they're constantly hustling for customers. In that hustle, it's really a buyer's market. There's excess manufacturing capacity, which means intense competition among suppliers. And so what this results in, this is a pretty relatively cheap sector to get into as a manufacturer. So you open up a factory, you have all these suppliers, and then there's this intense competition. And survival for the factory owner means offering lower prices than the competition and agreeing to contract terms that are overwhelmingly favorable to the buyers. brands have really, as been noted, like they are making choices based on how they can make the most money. And so they're intentionally sourcing from countries with low wages and perhaps weak labor enforcement. And they're doing this because it helps them drive down cost and avoid financial liabilities. The brands are trying to get product as cheaply as they can to sell it for the highest possible profit. And they're actually not only trying to keep prices low, but actually push prices lower each year. This issue of price pressure with brands pushing factories to give lower and lower prices has been well documented. There's a 2016 ILO survey in which more than half of apparel factory owners actually said that brands were paying prices that were lower than production costs. And studies in Cambodia and Bangladesh during the past decade have found that the prices paid for clothing were actually going down. So buyers were paying less and less for each item of clothing, even as the minimum wage and safety requirements in those countries were increasing. And this competition is really the key element. These factories are in really cutthroat competition for brands' business. This drives a tendency among many factories to violate workers' rights. Factories, and in fact, whole countries, are really competing for business from the brands and doing this by prioritizing lower and lower prices. So the way that this works is that there's a lack of enforcement of labor laws, often pretty good on paper, not very well enforced, both in the United States, although our law is less good, and in the countries where apparel is being produced, right? So in these countries, as been noted, you have very powerful industry associations. In Bangladesh, there actually many of the elected officials are also garment factory owners. And even if there's not that kind of direct capture, the governments really believe that foreign buyers want less regulation, lower wages, and they're scared of losing that business from the brands and retailers. So they're worried about, they're afraid to increase the enforcement of labor law. This means that factories know that they can illegally control costs. They can't do that with cloth, energy, transport. Those costs are fixed. But when they need to cut corners, they can squeeze their labor costs. They can pay less than minimum wage. They try to oppose unions that might push them to do things that would increase costs. They can cut corners on safety. And so as a result, you see poverty wages, poor working conditions, and really dangerous factories. I'm going to stay on that one. So downward price pressure isn't the only issue, I should note. There's also the fact that buyers are requiring factories to accept contracts with payment terms and other practices that heavily favor themselves and place significant additional risk on the factories. This has been particularly salient during the pandemic, which I think Anna is going to speak more about. When demand dropped as the pandemic hit, many buyers took advantage of skewed language in their contracts to cancel clothing orders that they had already designed and commissioned, that in some cases factories had already bought the materials for, even already produced and packed up and shipped. And so this meant that brands were refusing to pay, leaving factories on the hook, which put workers at risk of increased risk of wage theft and job loss. And this is one thing the WRC and Clean Clothes Campaign, Anna's organization, have been working on. And we've contributed to the reversal of $22 billion worth of cancellations. I'm going to end the slide share there. And I want to talk about a couple other aspects of this. Let me see how to get out of here. Okay. So the way, as Ben noted, one response that brands and retailers have had to this is to just deny responsibility. However, there's also been another more sophisticated approach, which is to claim that they should be able, that they are in fact now taking responsibility and should be allowed to just handle it themselves, that there should be no external accountability or regulation. And so that's something, in the late 90s, when companies like Nike and Adidas found that it was no longer working to just deny responsibility, they started saying that they were going to adopt their own codes of conduct, monitor factory compliance on their own, hire auditors to do it, and that they would just totally do that internally. They were not going to share any information, factory names and locations, working conditions, none of that. And as you can imagine, these codes and corporate social responsibility programs have a basic flaw, which is that they are voluntary and self-enforced. And it's always been clear to advocates that these voluntary codes are just the fox guarding the hen house. They're not adequate. And not only does that mean that there's a lack of accountability, but also the brands are actually undercutting their own codes of conduct constantly. Human Rights Watch and other organizations have observed that, you have one person from an apparel brand going to a factory and saying that they need to make the factory safer or respect the law. And at the same time, you have someone else from that brand going to the factory and saying, if you can't produce this product more cheaply, we're not going to buy from you. And so those two are clearly in tension, and the pressure for low prices wins out over respect for worker rights. Ben had talked about the Rana Plaza building collapse, in which more than 1,100 people were killed in Bangladesh in 2013, which really caught the world's attention. And out of that disaster emerged one of the solutions that we see as an alternative to this kind of CSR cover-up. The Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety is a binding agreement between workers in Bangladesh and their unions, global union bodies, and the apparel brands. And WRC and Clean Clothes Campaign are also witness signatories and involved in that project. This is an example of what we call worker-driven social responsibility, or an enforceable binding agreement, in which there's actually now a contractual obligation for these brands to ensure not only that they are telling factories to fix safety problems, to build fire exits, to make sure that the concrete of their building is strong enough not to collapse, to make sure that there are fire extinguishers, and that workers are allowed to freely participate in safety committees at each factory, but also the brands have to ensure that those changes actually happen and that the resources are available to make them happen, including the brands providing money directly where that's necessary. And this is an agreement that covers more than 200 brands, 1,600 factories. At its peak, it covered 2.4 million workers, and it has successfully required millions of dollars in repairs. So in Bangladesh in 2013, at the time of the collapse, there were no buildings with fully protected safety stairwells and exits. And now virtually all of these factories that require them have them virtually there. So that's a really kind of true accountability, and a model that we're seeing also we're trying to replicate in Lesotho in Southern Africa with an agreement on gender-based violence. Also in the United States, some people may be familiar with the Fair Food Program and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. That's a very similar model. And so that's really where we see the future of accountability. And Anna is going to talk a little bit about sort of what that looks like in this pandemic year and kind of what solutions we need to deal with the huge epidemic of wage theft that we've seen this year. Before I hand it over to her, I just want to touch briefly on something that our colleague Tola was going to cover, and I hope everyone will join me in just sending good wishes to Tola and his family today while they're grappling with an ill family member. I know he was very sorry not to be able to join. But he, Tola and his colleagues at Central work on the ground in Cambodia with garment workers, and they have really been dealing with the immediate impact of both government lockdowns, in which people were not only not going to work, but also often restricted to their neighborhoods and struggling to get access to food and other necessities. And then also with the epidemic of wage theft that we've seen. And wage theft is a really good example of the problems with this kind of supply chain, in which there's no accountability, and factories can really violate the law with abandon, and brands are often turning the other cheek if it helps their bottom line. So Tola has been working in particular with workers at Violet Apparel, where they've seen a form of wage theft that is a consistent issue in the garment industry, and even more so over the past year, which is a failure to pay severance. In many countries, including Cambodia, severance pay is legally required, and it's really crucial for workers to tide them over in the absence of government social safety nets. So if they lose their job, the severance pay from their employer is what they are supposed to use, what they should be able to use to support their families, get medical care, all of that while they're looking for a new job. But all too often, factory owners think it's easier to just skip town or declare bankruptcy and not pay out this money, because workers are often owed many months, even more than a year of pay per person. And that often costs more than the building and the sewing machines. And so it's easier to just abandon those assets and abandon the workers. This is an issue where brands will acknowledge the theft, they'll say that it's a problem, but they won't take responsibility for it, because in that case, taking responsibility for it would often mean taking money out of their own pocket, which is something they're very hesitant to do. So the WRC and Clean Clothes Campaign Also organizations like United Students Against Sweatshops in the United States and the unions we work with around the world have made this a priority over the past decade. And we have been able to, I think, shift the needle so that in individual cases, brands and retailers have paid out or required their brokers to pay out more than $20 million. This, however, the scope of this has only increased during the pandemic, including where it just becomes very challenging to deal with these case by case, and we're going to need a broader solution. So at Violet Apparel, one factory in Cambodia, this over 1,200 garment workers lost their jobs last year in July when the factory closed suddenly. The workers have reported and shown photos of them producing Nike apparel as well as a brand called Matalan. But Nike and Matalan have refused to take any responsibility and ensure that these workers receive the more than $300,000 that's owed to them. So this is just one small example of what workers are seeing around the world during the pandemic, this pandemic year. And I'll hand it over to Anna to speak more about that.
Thanks so much, Jess. Just a quick check again. Can you hear me okay? Or am I still breaking up? Okay, good. So my name's Anna. I work with the Clean Clothes Campaign International Office based in Amsterdam. The Clean Clothes Campaign is a network of organizations, actually. I think we have close to 240 members and partners based all over the world. And the WRC is one of our close partners that we work with a lot. Other partners in our network are unions based in production countries, but also NGOs focusing on labor rights, women's rights, or human rights. Obviously, we focus on the apparel sector, if that wasn't clear from the name. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about our campaign called the Pay Your Workers Respect Labor Rights campaign. And I'll introduce you to what the campaign is about and how we came to the demands of the campaign. So there's a lot of things that Jess and Ben have already spoken about that resonate a lot with me, and also what my experience was working with Clean Clothes Campaign over the past 2 years, a lot of things that I recognize. So I'll start by saying that when the pandemic started, I think no one could imagine the impact it would have on our industry. I think we really underestimated that, but very soon, I think in March and April last year, more and more cases started coming in. So how that works is that unions in Asia, not only in Asia actually, but back then it was mostly unions from Asia, started reporting cases. So either severance cases, wage theft cases, or union busting cases. I think those 3 types of cases were the most often reported to us. And I think this also sounds familiar to Jess. And at one point, the number of cases reported to us on a daily basis got so high that we realized this is too much. We cannot handle all these cases on a case-to-case basis. We need to think of a more structural approach on how to deal with the issues. And we very quickly recognized that there was a pattern. We saw that these 3 violations happened the most. So workers were not paid their full wages. This often happened because brands canceled orders, sometimes, as Jess was saying, when even if the products had already been made and were ready to be shipped. This was also happening because brands were delaying payments, sometimes up to 100 days after the products were made. So yeah, all of this happened, and then that made it very difficult or even impossible for some suppliers to pay their workers their normal, so pre-pandemic wages in time. So this immediately has an effect on those workers who often, even before the pandemic, were trying to make ends meet on very, very low wages already. So you can imagine that not getting your full wage that's already so low has a huge impact on these workers. And the other type of violation is what Jess just explained. If a factory had to close because the sudden drop in orders, a lot of workers who are entitled to severance pay didn't receive it. And what we also saw happening a lot was where a factory had to terminate some workers, but not all of them, that that then it was often union members who were fired the first, and then so this is what we call union busting. So very soon we recognized this pattern, and we realized, okay, if we want to make sure that no worker is forgotten in this pandemic, we have to find a more structural approach to this, while also continue to work on these cases. So we started an international working group in which the Worker Rights Consortium is very active, but also a lot of union members and other NGOs inside, but also outside of the CCC network. And we started working on a legally binding agreement that is modeled after the Bangladesh Accord. The Bangladesh Accord is the agreement that Jess was just referring to. So it's a binding agreement signed by brands, suppliers, and unions directly. And we're hoping that this agreement can provide relief to workers during this pandemic. So the campaign is calling on all brands to sign this agreement and to start negotiating with unions directly and start paying into the that this agreement will establish. So the campaign tactics that we're using, I would say we have a few campaign tactics. One of the strongest tactics that we're using in the campaign is actually to continue to highlight individual cases in the campaign. Because as Jess and Ben were saying, it's very easy for a brand to deny any responsibility. They'll say that other brands are doing the same, that they're not the only one, that we don't have our facts straight. And this is also why research is so important. It's very important that we as a campaigning organization make sure that we are still credible and that we have our facts straight. So this is what what the Worker Rights Consortium often helps us with, because if a brand finds that we have anything wrong or that we don't have our facts straight, they can immediately sort of ignore us. So this is what we do, and the reason why also casework is so important is because at one point we hope that for a brand, it's almost more annoying to work with us or to have to deal with us on a case-to-case basis. So it will be easier for them to just sign the agreement instead of fighting over individual cases with us. So that's one key component. The other reason why casework is so important is because that provides us with an opportunity to bring workers or unions' voices directly to consumers, because for consumers who have sometimes not a complete understanding of how supply chains work, it's often better if we can use a case to illustrate what's happening and then show the scale later. So first we explain what wage theft is, for example, or what severance theft is and how that looks like, what that means for a worker. And then we say, well, actually, this is not just happening in that one factory in Bangladesh, but it's happening to, I don't know, 2 million workers here and here and here, and also often closer to home than you think. So this is one way that we are trying to get consumers engaged. Another way, and not all brands are very sensitive to that, but is public campaigning. So this is social media campaigning that we're doing. Some brands are quite sensitive to reputational damage, not all of them, but like Jess was saying, some brands have some language in their code of conduct in which they promise to do X, Y, and Z for workers. So this, is good campaigning material for us. If they are saying that they should be doing something, we're hoping to be able to hold them accountable by, bringing that back to them and showing the public, like, hey, Nike, for example, said this and that. Don't you think that they should actually do it? Well, let's campaign on that. So that's another tactics. And the last one that's very relevant for us this week is investor actions. So we're trying to not only reach the brand through reaching out to their consumers, but to also go through their investors and try to influence the brand through their investors. Tomorrow, Nike is having their annual shareholder meeting. So we're trying to, we're taking some actions tomorrow. And hopefully Nike will hear us and their investors as well. I see that Jessica has already posted the link to our website, the campaigning website, in the chat. If you want to take action, if you have 1 minute, you can click on the link and sign our petition. I think we have nearly 50,000 signatures already. And there's a couple click to tweets that you can directly click on to help us with the campaign. And I think I'll stop here to also leave some time for Q&A.
Thanks, Anna. I think Ben's connection is giving him a little bit of trouble. So I'll just say, if folks have questions, I think the way to do it in this platform is to go ahead and put them in the chat. So please, and there's a tab to the right of the screen, to the right of the video, at least on my screen, you can see a session chat where you can post any questions. And Ben is just trying to reconnect, so you can have questions for us or for Ben. I guess
if
Anna,
there's no questions coming, oh, sorry. If
Go
there's
ahead.
no other questions coming in, I'll ask you a question, Jess.
Yeah.
And that's about a case that I think the WRC also worked on. And you spoke about the Violet case briefly, that involves Nike. But we do know that Nike is not unwilling, like per se, to paying up, because there is this case that I remember from Indonesia where they also paid, and I think it's a bigger amount even. So what do you think is the difference between these two cases, the Indonesian case and this Cambodian case?
That's a great question, and it's true that I think, as I said earlier, that brands have been very reluctant to provide their own money to address these cases, even when workers, had wages and severance stolen while performing work for those brands. I think that we have, in several cases, seen Nike actually provide that money in Honduras and in Indonesia. And I think that there are a couple of variables. One is, the level of public attention on the case. So I think what Clean Clothes Campaign is doing in the Violet case and what Central is doing is really important. Another is that, and there's two more, I think. One is if, in some cases like this, Nike has been able to require a broker or other business agent to put up the money. So the factory owner in these cases is closed, they're gone, the workers can't get any money from them. In some cases, maybe the workers have even occupied the building, made sure that they got their share of the assets, but that doesn't add up to the total necessary amount. And so in these cases, if we say to the brand, it's your responsibility to make sure that this money gets paid. You can pay it yourself, or you can pay it through the agent or broker. You can require that entity which placed the order in the factory to pay the money. And I think in some of those cases, that's why Nike was willing to, in the end, ensure that the money got paid, is because it didn't actually have to come out of their pocket. They were able to require another business partner to pay up. The third variable, I think, is university codes of conduct. So the WRC was founded with a mandate to verify that licensees, brands producing licensed apparel for the U.S. collegiate market were respecting the university codes of conduct. And I think that those do create, that's one sort of way that we've been able to experiment with having legally binding requirements on these companies, because they do have a contractual obligation to the universities to protect workers' rights to follow basic law. And so that is that's been the case in a number of the cases where Nike has provided the funds in other countries. So I think that, as you said, finding that this broader demand for a unified solution is the way we're going to solve this in the long run. But I think I do think that we have shown that we can also successfully press these brands to pay up when we work together. Yeah. Do you want to talk about, I'd be curious to hear sort of more about how, what brands are the focus of Pay Your Workers right now, and sort of why those brands became the focus.
Yeah, so currently we're focusing on 3 brands. One of them is Amazon, one is Nike, and one is Next, which is a British brand. I think these 3 brands were chosen to be the main targets of the campaign because we're keeping track of the cases that are being reported to us, and Nike and Next in particular, yeah, their names popped up a lot in our Airtable, so the place where we keep track of all the cases. And Amazon was picked, I think, because I think the main reason for that was because we knew that in the US there would be quite an appetite to campaign on them. I do have to admit that I don't think Amazon is a really winnable brand. I think they're quite immune to public campaigning. And also what makes it more difficult, I think, in this campaign is that they're not producing garments, that they're not selling garments exclusively. The same goes for Nike, of course, who are also selling other sports gear. But I think we might switch the main targets to that. But in principle, when we identify targets for a campaign, I think we would look at if the target is at all sensitive to reputational damage. So basically, if they are a good target, and I think Nike in particular is a good target because yeah, they're a very appealing brand to, I think, a lot of young people, a woke audience. So I think if we're able to show these young people wearing Nike that in fact what Nike is doing is not so cool, that will have an impact and that they will be sensitive to that. So I think Nike is still a great target. Something else that we're looking at indeed was what I was saying is the number of cases. But I think also what helps is if we know that a brand is open to signing a binding agreement. So we will also look at whether or not a brand has signed the Bangladesh Accord or now the International Accord on building and fire safety, or the Lesotho Agreement that you were mentioning, because if we already know that a brand has, yeah, some sort of structural problem with signing these agreements, then it doesn't make sense to continue to campaign on them, to ask them to sign the agreement. We won't let them completely off the hook, though. We will still campaign on individual cases involving them, but as a main target of the campaign, I don't think it makes sense to highlight such brands.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. I think I know Ben is like trying to get on, but I think we probably have time for one more question. And so maybe I'll just ask you, since you just mentioned the transition from the original Bangladesh Accord, which was signed and then extended, to this new international accord, which is really exciting. And I'm wondering if you could just share, maybe to close, share a little bit about that and what new opportunities it opens up to have this new international agreement.
Yes, I can, although I'm not super involved in that campaign. So the original accord expired. I think it actually has expired twice already, but then got extended also twice. But now, actually, I think just 2 months ago or something, a few brands and global union federations, and with the WRC and the Clean Clothes campaign as witness signatories, set up this new international agreement. And the opportunity that gives, well, us, but mainly workers and unions in other countries, is that this agreement will also allow for expansion to other countries. So I think hopefully the unions and the brands can also reach an agreement. I think Pakistan is the most likely first other country that will sort of benefit from the accord. But yeah, to be honest, I hope that it can go much quicker after that, because of course it was already great to have this agreement in Bangladesh, but yeah, we all know that garments are not exclusively produced there, and that factory accidents happen anywhere. I think we recently published a timeline of factory accidents that happened only in this year, and it's really heartbreaking to see, to be honest, how often that still happens and how little unions can do to prevent that from happening. It's really, everyone walks away from their responsibility. It's really painful to see. So I think this really shows that this agreement needs to be expanded also to other countries. So hopefully that can happen relatively soon. Ben is back.
Yeah, I don't know if it's working yet.
For a moment it was.
Yeah.
But
oh no, sounds like he looks like he's frozen again.
the technical difficulties there. I apologize.
Ben, I think, you're breaking up. But maybe I'll ask another question to Jess, and then maybe you can jump in again later. Jess, I know that you worked on a really good report called Fired Then Robbed. Maybe you can share some of the findings of that report with the audience, because it was a really strong report.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I can in a minute I can pop in the link. Yeah, so Fired Then Robbed was a report that we did, really trying to document the impact of the pandemic on the garment workers around the world, and specifically the amount of wage theft that was happening. And what we found was that just as the brands were really cutting loose the factories were really cutting loose the workers. And so what you saw was governments in many cases scrambling to set up programs that required some amount of payment while workers were suspended due to lack of production. You know, many governments already had in place requirements that workers receive, as I mentioned, severance pay or some amount of suspension pay if they were suspended. And factories really just flouting these laws. Factory owners, I think, panicking and just refusing to pay people. We saw some very creative schemes, at Hong Seng Knitting in Thailand. The factory circulated a piece of paper where they required virtually all the workers in the factory to request completely voluntary unpaid leave. Although, of course, if the factory manager is circulating the paper around and requiring people to sign it, that's not really fully voluntary. And in fact, it's not even really an option under Thai law to do that kind of leave. So we saw those kinds of creative tactics. And really, I can't pull up the numbers offhand, but Anna has put the link in the chat, a really staggering amount of wage theft across the world and retaliation against workers who spoke out. At Unigears in Bangladesh and at other factories, we saw people who were trying to say, hey, this isn't right, when they were suspended without pay or deny their wages in other ways. And then we saw factories firing them, intimidating them, harassing them. And that's really, unfortunately, a trend that we're still grappling with in Cambodia and Bangladesh and El Salvador and around the world. I think it's our wrap-up time, right? I don't know, Ben, are you able to do audio? Well, then maybe I will just, on Ben's behalf, I want to thank Anna for dialing in from Europe, from Amsterdam. I want to thank Ben for pulling this together. I don't think I know enough to thank everyone who helped. I know Julie Krzyzanowski helped us with tech, which was really fabulous, and thank the organizers of this conference for pulling this together. It's been, it's really great to be a part of this forum and to have the chance to speak about this work. And you can feel free to look up Worker Rights Consortium or Clean Clothes Campaign to find out more about the work and to check out the Pay Your Workers campaign. So thank you all.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Ben.